Hi, this is Richard Dunn at Evoca. In this video I'm going to show you how to make a rain system. Now we could easily make a rain system that just has rain falling to the ground and then nothing. However, what I'm going to show you here is how to spawn particles when another particle dies. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a system where our rain falls to the ground, detects collision with the ground or any other mesh that has collision on it, will then kill the particle on collision, which will drive an event that then spawns another particle, in this case a splash. With one particle we can actually have the effect of two particles being driven at the same time and for the same cost. I'm then going to show you how to hook up the particle so that the particle follows the player around. This is so you don't need to spawn rain throughout an entire level, which is just completely expensive and you just wouldn't do it. So what we're going to show you here is how to actually attach that particle system to the player so that it follows you around. Think of it like a rain cloud over your head that follows you around everywhere. This technique can be applied to anything. You can do it to a mesh, you could do it to a decal, you could do it to any type of entity, almost any type of entity in the engine can be made to follow you around. Right, so let's get started. So what we're going to do first of all is we're just going to make a rain shader. Okay, so what we're going to do is come into here. There's our snow material. We're going to use that for our rain. You may or may not choose to, but you could just make a copy of this and call it m_rain. There really isn't any need to do that. We can just use the same particle over again. The next thing we want to do, the same material over again, I should say. We could also use the embers, because what's going to happen is these are going to get stretched to look like water or rain motion blurring as it falls through the air. Either of these is going to give you a decent result. This is going to look like a streak. This is going to look more like a very long stretched ellipse, which is technically probably a better result, but it's a matter of opinions. Either of these materials will work fine. I would recommend the snow. The next thing we need to do is we need to make a texture that's going to give us the splash rings on the ground. So we'll jump into Photoshop now. Okay, here we are in Photoshop. What we're going to do is we're going to create a new texture and we're going to set its background color to black. So background color black. We're going to make it 512 like so. Now what we need to do is we need to find the center of this. So let's just drag in some guidelines and snap them to 256, which is half 512. This is just going to give us a rough center point to drag from. Now we need to create a ring texture. It needs to look like it's raised. Think of it like a hoop. It needs to look like half of a hoop. So what we're going to do here is we're going to create what's called a radial gradient. Now normally a gradient is done with this tool here, which can be hidden underneath the paint bucket. Up here is our controls. We've got a range of different gradients that come by default with Photoshop, and we also have a radial gradient here. Now a standard gradient looks like that. Of course that's not what we want. A radial gradient, if we drag from the middle, looks like that, which is almost what we want, but we need a ring. What we have there now is a dome. You could use that for a rivet. So what we need now is a custom gradient. So we're going to double click this, and we want black backgrounds. Now what I'm doing is I'm going to create some extra points. Let's give this one a name so you've got it for future use. We'll call it ring. And just save that as ring gradient. Now what we need to do is get some extra points, so we can just click where we want them like so. And we need to change all of these colors to black at the ends. So what we do is we click on the one, we come down to color, and we just type that in as black. Now we're starting to get the very beginnings of what we want. Now we have a white ring, but we have a very soft fall off, which isn't really going to give us what we want. So we need another one here to clamp that ring tight, and these need to be set to black as well. We can just type in 0, 0, 0. So you can see there now we can control the fall off of this ring. And we can also do it this way. We can use background color, which is what we have set as black. So what we're going to do here is we're just going to sharpen up one side of it. And we're just going to save what we've done. We're just going to shut this by okaying it. And we're now just going to drag out. That's what we get. Too much wasted space at the side again. Remember the overdraw issue. The other thing we need to consider is how thick the ring is. It might be a little bit too thick. So let's just go out a little bit more. No. A little bit more. Until you get it reasonably close. That's too close. That looks about right there. But the ring's too fat. Doesn't look like a concentric ring that you would get from a water drop. So let's go back into our gradient and let's just clamp these values up a little bit more on themselves. Let's just try that again. There we go, that's looking better. And that's all there is to it for that. So all we need to do now is save this out. Call this splash ring. And of course we don't have an alpha as usual. And we'll say that is 24 bits. And we're done. So all we need to do now is come back into our package, import that texture, splash ring, compression no alpha, give it a group. Incidentally, another way you can do this is just come in here and select groups from a predefined list, which will show up here. I've got it on another screen, but it will show up any groups that you've already created that you can pick from. And there's our ring. So the next thing we want to do now is just create the particle itself. So we're not going to select a material and create a particle, we're just going to go new particle, system. We're going to call this rain system. The reason I'm calling it a system is because it has the rain and the splashes built in. And we'll just save that. Right, now that our particle editor has opened, here we have the start of our rain texture. Now it doesn't look much like rain yet, granted, but it will. So what we're going to do here is, as I said, we're going to create a particle system rain. Now this system only works if you have light to very medium strength rain. You cannot physically spawn enough particles to give you a heavy rain effect. And if you did it by copying numerous particle systems around the map, it would become too expensive. There is another way of doing it if you're wanting like torrential rain. that it does not involve particles, but we will do a supplementary video on that at the end of this. But for now, what we're going to do is we're going to do a light rain, shower strength kind of a system with splashes that appear on the ground and any meshes with collision. So steps, buildings, anything like that, the splashes will appear on procedurally. So the first thing we're going to do is we need to load up our snow material that we've decided to use. So we'll find it in here. There it is. So we've got our stone material. And we're just going to load that into required, like so. So the first thing we want to do is change this to velocity so that we can stretch these particles. If you set that or you leave that to square, you can't stretch them. They will always stay spawning as these little squares here, which you can see going up and down. We don't want that. We want these to be very long and thin. So the next thing we want to do is set the emitter duration to 2, and we're going to set the macro UV radius to 1000. And that pretty much does it for the required field. So now we're going to move on to the spawn, and we're going to spawn initially. We'll type in 200 and we'll set our rate scale to about 100. Now the next thing that we want to do is we need to create a burst list. So what we're going to do here is we're going to come into here where the green cross is, and we're going to create a new burst list. And we're going to expand that, and we're going to just type in 5. We'll leave that at 0.1, and that should just about do it. These essentially override the spawning. Next we're going to deal with the lifetime, and we're going to set this to 1.5 and 2.5. And then we'll go to initial size, and this is where we're going to start to shape the rain. Now I've experimented with this and found that a good figure is 1, 20 and 0. Now we're starting to get, as you can see, these particles to stretch. And for the min, we'll go 0.6, 15 and 0. So what you can see here is effectively raindrop shaped drips. At the moment they could be passing for sparks, but at the moment that's what we've got. Now the next thing obviously we want to do is talk about the velocity, or the speed and direction. So we're going to come down to this, and we're going to come into the max, and we're going to put in a value of 0 for x. We're going to put in a value of 20. Again, play with these and get the effect that you want. These are just giving you a good starting point. And we're going to try something like minus 3,500 for z, which is our primary direction. We're also going to put in 0 here, 20 here, and minus 1500 here. This is just giving us variation. Now what's going to happen is our particle is now spawning underneath, as it should. What we essentially have here is a running tap. is probably the best analogy I can come up with here to explain. Everything is spawning from one point in space and going down in a negative direction. That's defined by the Z 3500 and the min minus 1500. So that's giving us a variation in speed, because if you look at rain, when you look at it, it appears that the drops are not falling at the same speed. It's just an optical illusion that we're trying to recreate here. So what we're going to do now, as we did with the smoke and the fire and all those other effects that you've already done, is we need to define an area that this rain is spawning from. So what we're going to do is go location, cylinder. We'll come back to the color over life, and we're just going to set this to draw so we can actually see what we're doing. Now if we go underneath, we're going to see a very small rain cloud essentially. So the first thing that we want to do is move this to a value that makes sense. So we're going to set this to 600 to give us a reasonable area. And we're going to set the start height to 500. This is lifting the cloud up into the air. So as you can see now, we have a very light rain effect. Very light rain. But again, if we come into here, we're only drawing these little red squares. There's no overdraw. There's no transparency really taken into account here, as you can see there. And on here, this is exactly like the viewport where we had shader complexity. There is no red and no pink. Therefore, at this stage, the rain is nearly a free effect, cost-wise. So the next thing we need to do here is just turn off the visibility of our cylinder. And we'll move on and just set up our color. So let's just come back to color over life. And we're just going to set this to a slightly blue color. So we'll set that to 0.5. You could set this to the same color as the snow, but this is water, so we'll go on a slightly different value. So we've just basically halved X and Y, or R and G, and left blue at full strength. So we have a very, very slight blue hue to the rain. Even though rain is transparent, you do actually need to give it some color, otherwise it just doesn't render very well. Now, as it stands right now, this rain is going to hit the ground and it's going to keep passing through the terrain. So what we're going to do at this point is we're going to actually put this particle system into our level to demonstrate how we achieve something. So here's our level. We're going to get the content browser. We're going to find our rain particle. Rain system, there it is, needs saving. And we're just going to drag this into the scene. And we'll just move it up in the air. Now if we go underneath, you can clearly see the rain is passing through the terrain and continuing all the way down quite a long way. This is not good. It's basically rendering down here when it doesn't need to. Ideally, what we want it to do is we want it to hit the ground and die. We want each particle to be killed as it intersects the terrain or any other object. And this is what we're going to do now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and set this up so you can see top and bottom. So it's submerged. Here we go. So you can see the rain above the world and below the world. So what we're going to do now is we're going to come into the particle editor. I'm just going to move this over like so. So you can see what's happening here and here. And I'm just going to configure this so that we can see everything we need to see. Here we go. Now what we want to do is we want to create a node called collision. Now we don't need to change any parameters in here, but you watch what happens when we add this. This rain will stop. And there you go. You can see here that we are now killing the rain the moment it hits the landscape. And you may have also noticed something else interesting. The rain intensified in value. That's because the rendering capabilities have improved since we culled down some of the cost. We've told this particle to spawn X number of particles in X amount of time. Because we've killed off their time frame, it can now spawn faster and more of them. So that's another reason to optimize your particle systems properly. So what we'll do is we'll just pull this back. Just minimize it. So that's what our rain looks like. Now it can be tweaked a lot more, and we can increase the complexity of this simply by either upping the spawn rate, or in the case of rain here, we could probably just alt drag and create a grid, and then we'll grab those three and alt drag them. Now we have a fairly heavy rain effect, and it's still incredibly cheap. If we look up at the sky, let's go out of the rain. You notice the sky hasn't changed. If we come down to our rain, you can see against the duck here that there is a hint of it going brown against an optimized green surface, but it's not that expensive. It's actually pretty efficient. But we wouldn't want to place these around the entire level at that density, because that would create hundreds of particles. So what we would do is we would actually group these and have it as a rain cloud following around the player, which we'll do in the next chapter. So the next stage of this is we want to create water droplets on the ground where each of these particles actually intersect. Now we don't need it at every single drop, because that would just be ridiculous and you wouldn't see anything. So what we're going to do is we're going to make a very quick material to simulate the water drop and the expanding ring going out as it over time it's going to get bigger. The trick with this is to keep it very small and keep it very subtle. It's something you notice if it's there, but if it's too big it just looks really bad. So we'll do that next.